what happens in America, and it happens on the left too, by focusing exclusively on race and gender, we forget that there's also a terrible class divide. And we then overlook how class operates in race and gender problems. The growing morbidity differentials in the United States seem to be explained not only by looking at race and gender, but by looking at class. In fact, class is a more strategic factor regardless of race or gender. As the public health expert Vicente Navarro noted, a very fine writer on health policy, Vicente, he should write more. I don't say that about many people on the left, but do of him. Quote, many of the things that are assumed to be characteristic of blacks are in fact characteristic of low income. But the U.S. government collects data only on race and gender, while ignoring class. Now this negligence, I maintain, is not indicative of a lack of class awareness, but of a keen sense of class. A sense of keeping it off the agenda, a sense of keeping it out of our consciousness. We don't deal with class. Equal protection of the law, due process, those always relate to race and gender and other things, not to class. The Supreme Court has made that very clear also. Now you look at class bigotry and it resembles race and gender bigotry. The lower classes were always seen as lazy, worthless, visceral, improvident, self-indulgent, morally depraved, criminally inclined, incapable of self-improvement, creatures of impulse and violence, self-victimizing. They were the authors of their own poverty. And of course, sometimes under very severe economic oppression, there are indeed social pathologies that take over in a way. Now that image fits the bigot's portrait of various ethnic groups, doesn't it? It's also isn't that far from the stereotype of women: weak, flighty, irresponsible, untrustworthy, not competent. In Christianity, you even got women as the evil corrupters and seducers, the Jezebels and the like. Well, I think I pretty much said everything I want here. Let me just give you one example, one or two more things, and then I'll wrap it up. Robert Cole, the Harvard psychologist, he did a study. He went and interviewed any number of people. He interviewed African-American families, working families, and he found that these African-American working families had a sense of class power. He found that his respondents would ask him if he also had interviewed, quote, the rich folks. So Robert Cole, being a good mainstream intellectual, liberal and all that, heard the rich folks, and of course, what did he understand? You can't be talking about class, you must mean race. He says, don't you mean the white folks instead of the rich? And they say, no, we mean the rich, the ones who decide how the poor folks live, they would say. One African-American lawyer, now this isn't the working class respondent, this guy was a lawyer, okay, but he's African-American. He says to Cole, if you want to know why black people live the way they do, you ought to talk not to the ordinary working class white people, because they're also victimized, but he suggested that Cole talk to the affluent and powerful people who own the farmlands and the factories. Here's a quote, they own everything and they decide what happens in this city and in all other cities, said this African-American lawyer. It gets even more interesting. Cole interviews white families, and they too begin to refer to the rich or the big shots with plenty of money and all the power they want. They didn't start with the usual thing about, oh, the blacks, they're on welfare, they're getting it all, and we're being neglected and all that. They talked about the rich. So Cole's interviewees Mostly working class African Americans and working class whites were introducing him to the concept of class power. He was introducing him to the concept of class power. They were taking the famous Harvard professor to school about something that academics and intellectuals in this country have programmed out of their perceptions, even when it hits them right in the face, and that is class power. He was asking working class people questions, but he forgot to ask them about class and class power. In sum, we don't have a full understanding of the functional imperatives of racism and sexism unless we take into account the political economic context. And by the way, my book, The Class Struggle, also argues that there's a political economic context for understanding perception, understanding the dominant paradigm, and understanding culture. Culture is both a dynamic, the outcome of a power situation, and also an instrument of that power. So we should move from attitudinal analyses to institutional and systemic analyses. We should see how class power translates into social and cultural power. Well, the failure to perceive racial and gender oppressions within the context of class power oppression leads to what I've called in one of my books somewhere along, I called it the competition of oppressions. I mean, I have sat in at meetings, I remember one in Washington, D.C., where people have gotten up, an African-American guy got up and he said to this white woman, he said, you may be a woman, but you're white. And she gets up and she said, yeah, you may be black, but you're a man. And then a third woman got up and says, yeah, you may be black and you may be a woman, but I'm a lesbian, and I'd like to see which of us gets turned down for a job. If I told the boss that I was a lesbian, I would have more. In other words, I'm more oppressed than you are. No, I'm more oppressed than you are. And that comes out of this idea, this feeling that after all, I feel the urgency of my oppression more than I feel the urgency of yours, but also if you can understand how more oppressed I am, then maybe you'd be doing more for this oppression. And in fact, I think in some situations, some oppressed groups are more oppressed than other groups. It depends on what particular thing you're looking at. Let me just end with a little story. I remember at the founding convention of the Committees of Correspondence, that convention took place in 1992 in Berkeley, California, where I live, just about a 15-minute walk from me up on the campus. So I went over and I attended the convention, and they were lining up. I never joined, but they were setting down their statement of goals and intentions, and a guy got up from the floor, had a microphone on the floor, and he says, you have nothing in there about the rights of gays. And they said, oh yes, let's put something in there, rights of gays. And a woman got up and she said, you have nothing in there, it should be gays and lesbians. He said, right, I said, gays and lesbians. A guy gets up and he says, now, transgender and transsexual hadn't yet quite come into vogue. That was a couple of years down the line. But he says, it should be gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. Because we bisexuals get discrimination from both communities sometimes. They say, oh, yes. They put gays, lesbians, bisexuals. And I was sitting there, and behind me was this old lefty trade union type of a guy, and he said, just loud enough for everybody to hear, he said, yeah, and how about putting something in there for the people who are too tired to have sex when they get home from work? And that, ladies and gentlemen, that's who I speak for, the people who are too tired to have sex when they get home from work, which by the way includes any number of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, everybody else, in this very exploitative, oppressive society.